Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, who is a lecturer both here at Purdue University Calumet and at Northwestern. This is Raymond Gleason, and Raymond authored a book called The Violent Season, The Generation Who Fought the Vietnam War. And it was published in 2013, and he's here to talk to us about it today. Ray, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background. You've served in Vietnam. Maybe you could give the audience some of that history here.
Well, I served in Vietnam. I did 3 combat tours with the infantry and the Rangers. And I wound up spending 25 years in the Army, mostly infantry, armored cavalry, things of that nature. When I got out, I wanted to get as far away from that as I can, so I went to graduate school in Northwestern.
Yes.
In fact, that's one of the first times I've actually had to explain to people what I was doing, and they thought I was kidding them. And I kept going to graduate school.
Yeah. Why?
You kidding, right? No, really.
In English, I understand, right?
Yeah, medieval.
Yeah.
You know, back to Latin. It was fun. After that, I had planned to make a career in academia, but I got sidelined again. I wound up being in business, mostly computers and things like that, which put 4 of my kids through college. And when I got done with that, I was able to do whatever I wanted to do. I taught high school for 12 years, ethics, and now I basically spend my time writing.
Good. And the book is a collection of stories about Vietnam, and it's told from the point of view of the what's the term you use? The
infantry,
foot soldier, or
infantry guys were called grunts.
The grunts. Yeah, I didn't want to say grunts. I don't remember if you used it or not, but okay. Yeah. So, so what's the difference? What's the difference between that point of view and what we see on TV or what we saw in the news? Tell me that.
Well, I think it's very different in tone. First of all, my perspective is from the ground looking out. I mean, these are experiences I had. These are people I knew. And from what movies I've seen supposedly portraying the Vietnam experience, they were very different than the people in those movies. Yeah. We were kids. Yeah. I got to Vietnam, I was 19 years old. Yeah. And most of my friends, 19, 20, 21, that was the average age of an infantryman. Right. In fact, we had one guy in our squad, he was 24. We called him Pops.
I see. None of the movies reflected what you saw. I know Apocalypse Now had a pretty young crew on that boat as they were going up the river, but that's about, you're right, it's about all I can think of.
That was a little bit too much Heart of Darkness
of course
for
it
me.
Was. Both of us being English majors, Heart of Darkness is the story by Joseph Conrad that Apocalypse Now was based on.
Yeah, and I can almost promise you I've never seen helicopters coming and playing Flight of the Valkyrie.
Right, yeah. So. I'm just thinking of that, the camaraderie and the spontaneity of that group.
Yeah.
But you would know.
Well, one of the best books, and they made at least 2 wonderful movies that I know of about how it was like to be an infantryman, is All's Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was very much, there's a wonderful scene in that, I think the main character's name is Paul, it's been a while, where he goes home for leave and he realizes, I don't belong here anymore. And
that was that came out in the 20s, right? Am I right? Is that?
The book came out after World War I. The first movie was, I think, in the 30s. And then they made another one, I think, in the 70s. Yeah. But that really tells, I think, truly what it feels like, almost viscerally, to be. Another good book is Stephen Halpern's Soldier of the Great War. Yeah. Those were very much 2 of my inspirations. And of course, I've read a lot and taught a lot of Hemingway, especially his short stories. And it's obvious in, especially when you get to something. Arms. Yeah. Well, Big Two-Hearted River. Yeah. It's obvious that this is someone who's suffering from what we would now call PTSD.
So did Hemingway get that right? The story that Ray's referring to here is Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway, which is about someone who comes back after World War I, and he's shattered, I guess might be the term that that we would have used then, and he goes back to Michigan, where he grew
Michigan,
up.
yes.
And he goes fishing. And it's mostly about going fishing, but you get this sense of his psychology through this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, again, I've taught that. In fact, I taught it as a graduate assistant. I remember the woman I was with, she couldn't stand the story. She said it was a story about a guy going out in the woods eating beans. But I think what Hemingway is doing, at least from my point of view, is he's trying to demonstrate how someone is becoming psychically alive through his senses. That he can actually taste things, he can actually experience things again. Of course, you end the story where all we know is he's coming back. We don't know what happens to him, but you know, very much that, and the story A Way You'll Never Be, which I think it precedes it.
And that was Hemingway's style, but he was particularly focused on using what in rhetoric we call the totis, where you are sort of under-describing things, playing them down extremely.
Minimalist,
so it has lines like, you know, the water was cold, you know, the line dropped in the water, the fish took it.
Yes, exactly.
But that, it seems to me, as we're talking now, that was also then significant because it was reflecting sort of the lack of complexity that this character had as he was sort of waking up and coming back to terms with.
And Hemingway himself was damaged from World War II, and you know, he was self-medicating with alcohol.
He served in Italy and was wounded, right? And a lot of speculation about how he was wounded, apparently. But
I don't want to go there, though.
Okay. So you see some similarities there then with experiences that you believe people had going to and coming back from Vietnam, and then also from what I know you've written about and what we talked about Iraq and in Afghanistan. Can we make some of those connections here?
Well, a couple of things comes to mind. First of all, I know a lot of veterans from Iraq and Iran, and you know, we have different ways of describing things, but we're basically in the same place when we think about that. We all agree, I think you mentioned earlier while we were just chatting, soldiers protesting the war. There was not a single guy I served with who liked what he was doing, in that he didn't wake up in the morning and say, boy, it's great to be in a war, isn't it? You know,
that's Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Why that wasn't very accurate, right?
Nobody was like that. We hated the war. We didn't want to be there, but you know, one of the points I try to make in my book is one of the brave things that we all did is, regardless of how we felt, and by the way, many of us realized quite often that the strategy we were pursuing in Vietnam was not workable over time.
The domino theory.
Well, not the domino theory, but it's say in the book, you know, we go out, they're on a hill, we chase them off the hill, we stay there for a couple of days, we go back and they're back on the hill. What's the point of this? You know, guys understood that clearly, but I think every morning they got up, and even sometimes, you know, assuming the futility of what they're doing, they still did it.
Right. Well, and I assume at some point you're fighting to save yourself and your comrades, right? And the military strategy is something you don't always have time to consider, right?
Right. After a certain point in time, no one out there is willing to die for the big picture. They're willing to go out, and because their friends are there, they're going to take care of their buddies. And they know that their buddies depend on them. They depend on each other. So the one thing you would never do is basically abandon your friends. You just wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I have a friend who wouldn't appreciate my retelling this story, but he had a story like that, and a lot of him and his comrades were wounded or killed trying to save somebody at one point. Did you see a lot of that?
Fortunately, too much.
Yeah.
I got over there when we were rolling into the first phases of the counter-Tet Offensive in 1968. We basically had to push the North Vietnamese Army, let me just get my directions here, this is bad for a ranger, west of Highway 14 and out of the cities.
Yeah, so for our younger viewers, the Tet Offensive was 1968, and essentially the South Vietnamese army basically blew out. They used whatever they had and gave this sort of all-out attack, and it looked as if they were pushing the United States back, but they'd actually, from what I understand of this historically, depleted their resources to the point where they were really not a factor in the war past that point, and it was the North Vietnamese army that ended up moving in. Is that correct?
Well, it was mostly North Vietnamese regulars after Tet of '68 because the Viet Cong basically were extinct.
Really?
Yes, there were Viet Cong units on the ground, but they were actually manned by North Vietnamese in North Vietnamese uniforms, things of that nature. And again, I talk about this in the book. The North Vietnamese strategy was probably the same strategy we had in our revolution. Washington understood clearly he didn't have to defeat the British. He had to prevent the British from defeating him. The North Vietnamese understood clearly they didn't have to defeat the American army. They had to prevent being defeated. The Tet Offensive of '68 militarily was probably a blunder.
It was a disaster, right?
For them. But as you mentioned, as far as public relations go, it's probably what turned a corner as far as the American appreciation, American perceptions about that war.
Well, I think it put the news media in a position where they had to start looking to see if there was another side of the story. And you know, of course, Westmoreland, I think, you're probably familiar with this, I think sued CBS because he claims they undermined America's support for the war with their coverage.
It didn't help, I'll tell you that.
Well, and that's something maybe we can talk about after the break a little bit, is what's, you know, once the United States commits to something like that, what's the role of the news media? What's the role of the average citizen? We're a media department here. We teach journalism and things like that, and it's a topic that comes up often, and it'd be interesting to hear from your standpoint, not just as someone who fought, but someone who is also an academic and also perhaps understands the perspective that we're trying to take at the university. So the book is also now out in paperback.
Right. This is the paperback. It's been out in a Kindle version for about 9 months.
Okay.
This is the paperback. It came out about 2 months ago.
Very good. We are going to take a quick commercial break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and today my guest is Raymond Gleason. Raymond is the author of The Violent Season, The Generation Who Fought the Vietnam War. Ray and I were talking about a minute ago about the Tet Offensive, and that brought up the impact that had on the news coverage. And so, since your book kind of tells us the story from the standpoint of a grunt, someone who's out there in the field, what were your perceptions, the perceptions of the people around you when the news coverage changed after Tet?
Well, we weren't there to experience it. I mean, coming home was a shock to a lot of us. When I got into Oakland Army Base, we were actually told, don't go into San Francisco. But if you have to go to San Francisco, don't wear your uniform. And we're sitting there going, what? I mean, one guy said, we going to San Francisco? We going to play coup? I mean, we were kind of amazed by that.
How long had you been gone at that point?
About 18 months, 19 months.
Okay, and so when you left, you didn't have any sense of
No.
opposition to the war.
It was the public opinion of the war and the soldiers who fought it went 180 degrees.
Yeah, yeah. I know, and I was saying that my experience in the Chicago area, particularly in the South Side, veterans were involved in the protests. So I didn't, I always thought that was a little bit hyped. I really didn't see people protesting the veterans. I saw the veterans and the protesters kind of protesting the war policy. But obviously things like that went on. Certainly, we've all heard the stories about San Francisco and some things on the East Coast as well.
And as I mentioned before, most of the guys I fought with hated the war. It wasn't something that we wanted to be in, but we decided we were there. We did our duty, and like I said, we did our duty for each other more than anything else.
So, what's the role of the news media and the public? I guess we should take those one at a time. But once we've been committed to something, now of course we call Vietnam a police action, not a war. But in practical terms, it was a war, right?
Yeah.
Once the United States has been committed to something like that, how do you, just in your own terms, I mean, how do you see the role of the news media, for instance?
Well, first of all, the police action. I remember, I guess it was in the 80s. I was in the Army. I was an infantry officer. We used to go after duty to a VFW hall. I remember going in one afternoon, and there was a guy probably about my age now, World War II veteran. He looked at my combat infantryman's badge, and he said, "Vietnam, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Yeah, that wasn't a real war."
Oh, really?
And I just looked at him. I said, "Yeah, you're right. The North Vietnamese use rubber bullets, It was a real war. I mean, we fought real battles, especially with the NVA.
Well, I'm really surprised that you got that comment, because I had a high number. My number was like 283.
Yeah.
There was we probably went in before the lottery started.
Oh, I joined.
You joined, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so for people who aren't familiar with this, so I think in '69, maybe it was 70, they created a lottery. So they drew a number, and you kind of had a sense of whether or not you were going to be drafted or not. Unless you were joining, then you knew, of course, you were going over. Yes, but once that happened, it kind of changed the perspective on things a little bit. But I had a high number, was what I was going to say, and I was glad. I had this terrible idea of what this was going to be like, and I grew up sort of romanticizing World War II, right?
Right.
Because we grew up with all these World War II movies with John Wayne and all these heroic actions, and you played Army, and you envisioned yourself, throwing yourself on a grenade to save your buddies, and all of these, all of these scenes that you saw, But I remember when Deer Hunter came out.
Yes.
And it showed, these guys who got captured and tortured and put in bamboo cages and kept underwater where they could barely, get their noses high enough to breathe, and playing Russian roulette for fun. And I remember seeing that and thinking, this is worse than World War II. This is, again, I'm looking at a movie here. I wasn't there, but I remember thinking, this is worse than anything that I've imagined.
Yeah. Well, the way some of our POWs were treated in the Pacific Theater was pretty horrific.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much we can compare. I think our sense of both were wars, was very, very different. I guess we could spend hours talking about that.
Well, it's an interesting subject, because you've got the mustard gas in World War I, and then you've got the horrible slaughter of the Civil War, where people were just facing off against one another basically with cannons.
Right. Len Drayton, I think is his name, wrote a book called Bomber, about World War II. I think he wrote about the firebombing of Dresden.
Yeah.
That was pretty horrific.
Yeah.
You asked earlier about war, and I have to tell you, my attitude about war is if you're going to war about something, the issue has to be important enough where you can say, it's all right if my child dies there, because people's children die there. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But so how did you feel about Vietnam?
Feel?
I mean, along those lines.
Again, I do believe that in many ways what we were trying to achieve in Vietnam was worthwhile. Essentially, we went over, many of us believed that we were in a death struggle with world communism. Yeah. We did believe that we were there to allow the South Vietnamese people to decide their own form of government. Of course, the cynical way, as long as it's our form, you're okay. But many of the guys did believe that. That's why they came there. But like I said, after a while, those things kind of went away, and it was just you, me, and those guys. I'll help you. We'll try to get out of this thing alive, and whatever happens, happens. So how do I feel about Vietnam? I feel it's a tragedy. Tragedy for the Vietnam people. They still celebrate something I think they call Black May, which commemorates when the North Vietnamese took over and what happened after that. It was many ways a tragedy for us. Many of our families still haven't gotten over loss of loved ones. And I think it's a tragedy because we tend to turn around and say, well, what did we get? And people say, oh, we got defeated, we didn't get anything, which is not true.
Right. Yeah, it's not fair to say we were defeated there.
Right.
The interesting thing, though, is that the predominant theory didn't play out. I mean, except for what Cambodia fell.
Right. Well, and again, why that happened, either the theory wasn't correct or the North Vietnamese military was so exhausted by that 10-year struggle that they couldn't pull it off.
Right, right.
Who knows?
Right.
But in many ways, again, it was an absolute tragedy. Now, again, on the other side, we usually see in the movies, our guys doing horrible things. Fighting a war is a horrible thing. Yeah. But the other thing I've seen is people who, have practiced acts of selfless heroism. Right. Which is absolutely unbelievable. I guess it brings out a lot of times the best and the worst, and most of what I saw was the best in people.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so just to stick with the news media side of this for a moment, I think most of us would agree that it's not appropriate to protest against the people who went over to fight for their country, right? But what do you think the role of the public is and of the news media is when once an engagement has been initiated, right, and a war is being fought or something close to a war is being fought? Do we have a right? Do we have a responsibility to debate the wisdom of that?
Oh, absolutely. I think to deny that would deny one of the basic premises of what America stands for. Yeah. We during World War II, conscientious objectors were vilified.
Oh, yeah.
We had conscientious objectors in Vietnam. In fact, one of our medics was a conscientious objector, but he said, I'm against the war, but I'm going to do my duty. And he went in all the same places we did. He went unarmed. Medics in Vietnam were armed. Yeah. This guy refused to carry a weapon. He says, I'm against that.
Is he one of your stories?
Tell me how brave that is. There's a Doc character in there, but no, he isn't. He became my special case. I was still in the infantry units then. And I just told him, Doc, you just stick with me. I said, if you won't do it, I'll do it. But because we really, a good medic was worth $1 million to us. These were guys who would go out and get you if you couldn't make it in yourself. So when we had a good one, we made sure he was taken care of.
Yeah. Well, and it's good that we don't forget those stories because I think anytime someone puts themselves in harm's way for their country, whether they agree with the decision that was made in Washington or not, right? I mean, they're all making the same sacrifice, essentially.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. There's 3 chapters I call the Chupa. It's based on a battle that was actually fought. And as our forces are approaching the objective, everybody's going, what are we doing? This is stupid. I mean,
Yeah.
we couldn't have messed this up worse if we tried.
Yeah.
So they understood clearly. But again, as I said before, one of the things I always admired about the guys I serve with is we got to do it.
Yeah.
You know, my buddies are doing this. I got to go with them. I have no idea what's going on. I don't feel good about this. I think it's a stupid thing to do, but we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And that played out day after day after day.
And the leadership was pretty young as well, right? I realize we're running out of time here, but it wasn't...
Platoon leaders were 24, 25. Company commanders were in the late 20s, early 30s. Battalion commanders were probably old men of about 33, 34. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a young man's game, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. Okay, well, I'm glad that you were able to come on and we're able to talk about this a little bit more.
Good.
I just, you know, it's interesting. I just was cleaning out my attic and I found my friend's Army shirt with his name on it. He was in the, actually was in the Green Beret in Vietnam. And I was, about 30 years ago, I was going by his mother's house and she had a garage sale and she was selling his stuff. So I bought it and then I didn't see him because he was out of town. It was in my attic and I just found it and called him and he came by and picked it up 2 weeks ago. So we had a conversation.
Does it still fit?
I don't know, but he was happy to get it back.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, that's all the time we have on our program today. Thank you for joining us at the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.
This episode is dedicated to all of our veterans for their sacrifice and brave service to our country. You have our admiration and gratitude.